A Traveler in Time by Alison Uttley. Chapter 3. The Herb Garden. Uncle Barnabas had a favorite seat where one could always find him. It was under a great oak in the croft, near enough to the farm for him to see all that went on, but leaving him free of the bustle and busyness if he wished to be quiet. He sat there in the evenings, watching the moon rise above the woods, listening to the call of owls and the rustles of nocturnal creatures. He went there when work was done, taking his rest away from us all. Sometimes I joined him, for he didn't mind my company. I could be part of the land and forget myself as he did. There we sat, my hand clasping his great warm fingers, as we waited to see the moon shadows and the starlight. Behind us in the house was the joyful preparation of supper, with Alison singing and Ian teasing. From where we sat, we could see the glow in the kitchen and the figures moving in the firelight, and it used to amuse us to watch them, unconscious of our gaze. "They don't know we sees 'em," whispered Uncle Barney, so softly I could scarcely hear, silent as if he didn't want to disturb the shadows round us, and a hedgehog passed us by, and a rat slipped through the undergrowth. As I sat there one evening, listening to the swallows which were darting in and out of the barn, for it was early and light had not faded, I was conscious of much movement and excitement in the great farm kitchen. People walked in and out of the firelight and came to the porch. Strangers whom I did not know. Women wearing full gathered skirts and wide aprons and little ruffly collars. Men in padded breeches and leather jackets and hunting boots. Some had bare legs and short, ragged leather trousers, and their hair was wild and tousled. They carried shining dishes and wooden bowls and leather jugs. They stooped over the fire, and one lighted a slip of wood and carried the flame to candles fastened to the wall. Then I saw them more clearly, their rosy faces and brown hands and rough uncut hair. They pushed and joked, or so I imagined, for I could not hear a sound. Through a bedroom window I espied another face, a boy older than I, with fair hair and keen blue eyes. His face was eager and gay, and he looked at the oak tree where I sat, invisible to him. He took a bow from the room behind him and fitted an arrow and shot at the tree's trunk so that I winced and drew aside. "Who are they?" I asked Uncle Barney. "Who are those people and that boy?" "Uncle Barney," I cried, striving to make myself heard, but there was no sound except from my beating heart. "Uncle Barney, who are they? What are they doing here?" I asked again, and the words were like rain falling from the clouds or mists coming over the fields making a pattern. "Uncle Barney!" I made a desperate effort and clutched his arm, and a cry broke from my throat, a queer, strangled voice. "Hello, have you been asleep, Penelope? Poor little wench, you've had a nightmare," said he, gently stroking my arm. My voice had come back, and I asked, choking with the effort, "Who are those people?" Uncle Barnabas slowly turned his huge body and followed my trembling finger. Even as I pointed, the lights dimmed, the serving men and women faded away, and there stood my Aunt Tissy with her copper kettle, and Alison in her little apron, and Jess piling logs on the fire. "Only your Aunt Cicely, Anne, and Alison. You've been dreaming," said Uncle Barney again. I kept close to him, and when he rose to return for supper, I went too. Everything was as usual, and there was a welcoming creak of chairs and crackle of the fire as we went into the kitchen and sat down to the table. The surprise which Aunt Tissy had promised us arrived one morning soon after this. There was a clatter of hoofs in the lane, and a young man rode up the drive on a chestnut pony. "Here's Mr. Taberner," said he, leaping down, and he led the pony to the barn door. "Here her is. I couldn't get with her afore, 'cause they're thrutched with work at Bramble." "How do you like her, Penelope?" asked Uncle Barnabas. "She's glorious," I cried, patting the arched neck. "Whose is she? Is she yours?" "I've hired her from Bramble Hall for a bit, for you three to ride," said Uncle Barney. "It will do you good to learn to manage her. She's good-tempered, for I bred her myself." The pony nuzzled at his pocket and gave a whinny of recognition. "Aye," he continued, "she's been inside Thacker's afore. Saw the door open and walked in and helped yourself to a cake, didn't you, Betty?" The pony whinnied and stamped her hoof, and the young man grinned. We thanked Uncle Barney, bewildered by the good fortune, for we had always wanted a pony to ride. We once had lessons in London when father was able to spare a little money, but we had never been on a horse outside the riding school. Then Aunt Tissy came out with sugar and bread. "Betty, you beauty," she cried, flinging her arms round the pony and kissing its soft nose. "Welcome home to your old stable, my pet." "Ian must look after her, groom her, fettle her, and you must take turns in riding," said Uncle Barnabas, and he gave us a lesson in management and showed us where to hang the saddle. Ian mounted at once and trotted round the yard and out to the field. I raced upstairs to change my apron and tunic. I flung open the door and I fell headlong down a flight of stairs. I had dropped into the corridor where I had seen the servants pass with their jugs and tankards. For some time I lay half stunned with surprise, but unhurt, for I had fallen silently like a feather floating to the floor. I looked round at the door, but it had disappeared. I stared at the low whitewashed ceiling and the carved doorways, and I listened to the beating of my heart, which was the only sound. Then life seemed to come to the world. Distant shouts of men, the jingle of harness, and the lowing of cattle. A cock crew as if to wake the dead, and I sat up trying to remember. "Gramercy, what's this ado?" cried a shrill voice, and a young woman came round the corner and stood with arms akimbo, looking at me. "What do you hear, wench? You no occasion to come up here. I'll lay your peering into what doesn't concern ye. So get ye down to the kitchen. What are you doing? Has my lady sent for you out? Who are ye?" "Who are ye?" I echoed, struggling to my feet, dazed and confused, and even my own voice sounded hollow and remote to my ears. The young woman flared up angrily and shook a warning finger at me. Her clumsy body bent forward, and she muttered half under her breath, "Don't you be impertinent. Don't you dare mock me." But I had no intention of mocking. I had used her words to recover my wits, which had forsaken me completely. "Haste down to the kitchen to Dame Cicely. The mistress is waiting for her posset," said she more quietly, and she pointed down the passage. I went meekly past the closed doors with the carved lintels to a stone stairway, up which a young, pretty servant girl was coming. Her round face was tanned and freckled, and her little snub nose and bright red lips were beaded with moisture. She wore a full blue skirt, kilted out of the way, for her small brown feet were bare. A bonnet of lawn covered her ruddy hair, and she tossed her head to shake back a curl. In her hands she carried a basin made of birch twigs, and a mop and a wooden bucket of hot water. She looked up and saw me, and she stopped dead, staring at me with her wide brown eyes, startled like a deer. "Who art thou, mistress?" she asked, and she puckered her red lips and spoke with a broad accent which was homely and welcoming to me. "Dost want Dame Cicely Taberner?" "Yes, please," I faltered. "Miss Cicely Taberner I want." "She's down in the kitchen making the bread." The girl spoke slowly, and she put down her bucket in the corner and accompanied me with many a backward glance at my dress and surreptitious peep at my face. Along the stone passage to the room I knew so well. There was the same big oak table in the middle of the floor, and the same spice cupboard with its multitude of little drawers against the wall. The bare scrubbed boards of the table were heaped with a medley of things: wild ducks in their feathers, pigs, white pettitoes bleached for cooking, a wide basket of apples, wooden and earthenware bowls, and an enormous rolling pin like a truncheon. Strange smells came drifting through the air, pungent odors of spices and meats and smoke from the fire, and strange people were standing about on the flagged floor where green rushes were strewn. A great fire burned in the open hearth, and round it were saucepans of brass and iron simmering in the edges of the flames, and sending out the heavy odors which pervaded the room and made me feel giddy as I stood in the doorway surveying the scene. The stove with its ovens and hobs was no longer there, but hanging from the iron ratchet which Aunt used for her pig-food kettle was a large cauldron with meat simmering, and curls of blue vapor rising among the flames. On the floor, in front of the blazing logs, was a spit, with a humpbacked boy turning the handle and watching the roasting fowls drop their fat into a dish below. He stared at me, unsmiling, his green eyes bright in the firelight, his rough mop of black hair glittering round his small, pointed face. Then he went on with his work, but his gaze never left me, and I felt discomfort under that inimical stare. I saw a woman who was surely my Aunt Tissy, grown taller, stouter, younger, and more comely, but with the same broad, good-tempered face, and the same hooked nose and rounded cheeks. Her lips were parted and her forehead wet with sweat. She was kneading the bread in a great wooden trough like the horse's manger, and her plump arms were deep in the folds of the dough. A young girl was cracking and beating eggs in an earthenware bowl, and tossing the shells to a corner of the room where a vast heap lay like foam. Another woman was stirring custard in a brass pan, chattering all the time. On a rack above their heads hung 100 or more oaten cakes, big as dinner plates, drying in the fire's heat, and a barrel of meal stood on the floor and a wooden jug beside it. The servant girl pushed me gently forward as I lingered in the doorway, and my aunt looked up from her kneading trough. "Lord have mercy on us, who's this?" she cried, and for a moment her cheeks paled, and the pupils of her blue eyes dilated. But her voice was deep and rich as ever, with a burr in it which always made me feel warm and happy. "It's me, it's Penelope, Aunt Tissy," I cried, running forward quickly, and my heart rejoiced to see my beloved aunt. The others stared open-mouthed, but Aunt Tissy carefully removed the clinging dough from her arms and dipped her fingers in the flour barrel to dry them. She came slowly across the room to me, for I had hesitated halfway across the floor, bewildered by the strangeness that assailed my eyes and nostrils. I stood mute, like a little wild creature, wrinkling my nose at the smells of humanity which were unlike those I knew. Aunt Tissy put her hands on my shoulders and tilted my chin to the light. Her puzzled blue eyes gazed into mine, her fingers caressed my cheekbones, and her thumbs poked my dimples. "Who art thou, little wench?" she asked quietly, softly. "Thou call'st me aunt, niece Penelope. Art thou a niece of mine? What's thy name?" "Penelope Taberner Cameron," said I, and the words dropped from my lips one by one as I made the effort to remember. As I stood there, breathing the air which was different, feeling strange emotions in my heart so that I was half trembling with fear, I stretched out a hand to hold the table, to get courage from the rough wood. Sounds I knew came from the open door. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" called a bird in the wood, which I glimpsed through the portal, and the doves cooed in the yard. My heart stopped its wild beating, and I turned with a timid smile to my aunt, who was staring at me. "Penelope Taberner," she repeated, ignoring the Cameron. "I can scarcely believe it, yet thou art a Taberner, in spite of thy dark hair cut like a youth's. A dimple in thy cheeks, and the same crooked way of smiling, the same round mouth, and the little twist to thy eyebrow as one or another of us always has, and always will have as long as there is a Taberner left." She paused in her inspection and frowned, and took my hand in hers as if she would read the lines. "Thou hast not worked hard, for thy hand is soft and white as my lady's. Where dost thou come from, my sweeting? I know most of my kin round hereabouts, but I disremember you, although I can't keep stock of brother Andrew's 20 children. Are you one of them, or are ye a daughter of Elizabeth, who had 14 wenches as well as 4 boys? Where do you come from, Penelope?" "From Chelsea, Aunt Tissy," said I, slowly, trying to remember more. But my mind was away, lost in the shadows which flickered across the doorway and raced over the fields outside. "Chelsea? That's a village near London. I've heard Master Anthony talk about it, for he took Mistress Babington there once. Maybe thy mother was a servant maid to her when she was there. It's a powerful way off, and I've no relations living there as I knows of, but I've lost count of some of 'em. There was niece Marjorie, but she married a farmer Ashover way, and you're not one of hers. And there's niece Sarah, and Rachel, and Mary, and Susanna, and Jane, and every one of 'em has a mitherin' lot of childer, some of 'em old enough to be wed, and many a Penelope among 'em. There's Robin, and Ralph, and John Taberner all got daughters. Whose maiden be ye?" I shook my head. All memory of my mother and father had disappeared. I knew nothing about them. Only Thacker's and the unchanging landscape remained, familiar and dear to me, as if I had known it from time everlasting, as if I were part of it, immortal soul of it come back to the loved place. "Aunt Tissy," I pleaded, "I've come to Thacker's to learn the ways to be with you and to stay as long as you'll have me." Then with a flash of memory I added, "My mother sent me to be with you." "Well, whoever ye be, ye are more than welcome, for there's no shadow of doubt you're a Taberner, and a good-bred one, although not as strong-looking as ye ought to be. Here ye shall live, Penelope, as long as ye will. The last Penelope who lived here died a while back. She was my favourite niece, and when her father was killed in the war in the Netherlands, she came to me. It was same as a ghost come back to see the likeness between ye, but she's in the churchyard yonder under sod, and ye are alive and blooming like the rose." She looked down at me again with a kindly, welcoming manner, and then she seemed to be aware of my clothes, for she gave a sharp cry. "Where didst thou get those weeds, my chuck? Where's thy baggage? Have ye no belongings? How didst thou travel here?" I shook my head dolefully. "I can't tell. I can't answer," I muttered. "You don't know?" exclaimed Aunt Tissy, astonished, but not more surprised than myself. "Nay, that beats all. If ye ain't my own kin, I should say ye was simple," and she clucked her tongue in consternation. The kitchen maids crowded round me and touched my dress with curious fingers. I looked round at my navy serge tunic and the little striped apron I had worn when I was helping Aunt Tissy. It wasn't I who had changed, but my surroundings, I reminded myself, as they whispered and nodded and pointed at my shoes. "They may be out of the oak chest on the landing," said one of them, as I stood miserably blushing with the attention I had caused. There's a store of ancient clothes for the poor and needy, gear of well nigh 100 years in that chest. Or she found 'em in the play-acting chest, where the mistress keeps her garments for mummin plays and Christmas routs and junketings. You might have found something similar than that doublet if you wanted to dress up and surprise us, said another. Where have you hidden your ordinary gear? Asked the one whom I had seen the first, who now entered the room. I found her on the landing near the mistress's chamber, and maybe she's been inside poking about. No, aunt, I cried, and tears sprang up to my eyes. These are my own clothes, and I haven't any more. Mercy, don't weep, my pretty. I mun make you some more, for those are not seemly, said Dame Cicely, and she wiped my eyes with her apron and put her arm around me to shield me from the others. Tabitha, she called to the pretty girl who had met me on the stairs, take Penelope upstairs to my bedchamber and put some more womanly weeds on her to cover to her long legs. She's like a lad in that garb. I wouldn't have the mistress see my niece so. It's the dress of a London prentice she's wearing, and it becomes her. Leave her, Dame Cicely, said Tabitha. She's bonny in them, and the mistress won't mind anything on a day like this. She'll laugh, maybe, and it'll do her good. For poor debts and Master Anthony, God bless him, bringing anxieties to this place where nothing's ever happened since Adam and Eve were on earth. Have it thy own way, laughed Dame Cicely. I'll tell Mistress Babington and Mistress Foljam that my niece has come from Chelsea to help me, and she'll be right glad to have ye in the household, and whoever was your mother, ye are a Taberner, and the very image of her who died and is buried out yonder. Ye shall sleep in my bed, for it's had an empty place since she left us. Phoebe shall make a new smock for ye, and I'll lend ye a night rail of mine, although thy little body will be lost in it. She looked me up and down, considering my position in the household. Niece Penelope, canst thou sew and cook and milk the kine? She questioned. There's a plenty work to be done here, and no room for an idle maid. I don't sew very well, and I can't cook, I confessed. Maybe you've been educated above thy station, she said, cheerfully. Canst read and write like the quality? Oh, yes, said I. That's more nor us can do. I can't read a word, but I keep this household going. I carry my knowledge in my noodle. Have no use for printed books. Receipts for cooking and making of drinks and possets, I know them all. I remember the old ballads, and I know the psalms so that I can sing without a psalter. I keep a tally on the doorpost of the number of eggs and chickens and ducklings we have. I've done very well without reading and writing, and I keep my wits clear by not adding them with rubbish. But Mistress Foljam will be glad of thee. She'll maybe make thee her own maid. They all talked together, but I was too much astonished to utter a word, and I looked round the Thacker's kitchen as if I had never seen it before. The passage to the dairy had gone, and the pantry was part of the big room. Aunt Tissy was different too, although I should have recognized her anywhere, whatever she wore. She had on a full dress, not much bulkier than the one she wore that morning when we sat down to breakfast at the same table, and a time that had slipped from my memory so that I could not remember who sat there with us. The cherry-red woolen skirt was short enough to show her square buckled shoes, rough and strong, but neatly made. Her black bodice was fastened up the front with little wooden buttons carved like acorns, each button slightly different from its fellow. A white cambric collar, creased and crumpled with work, was round her neck, tied at the front with a black tasseled cord. On her thick hair was a fold of linen, like a cap, snowy and fresh, and her apron was gathered and pleated in many folds round her large waist. Her face had the same serenity, and she twinkled at me and laughed with loud laughter like a man's as she saw my astonished eyes, which were open as wide as they could be in complete bewilderment. "Thou art an old moppet," she cried heartily, and she laughed so much that tears came sparkling into her eyes, and all the maids laughed too. But the green-eyed boy glowered at me and covered his eyes with his hands when I peered his way. "Ye are a sweet toad, and as like my great-niece Penelope was at thy age as 2 peas in a peas-cod. Come here, my sweeting, and give me a kiss." She enfolded me in her flowery arms and printed a loud, warm kiss on my lips, in just the way Aunt Tissy always welcomed me when she saw me in the mornings. "But dinna ye call me Aunt Tissy. That's a name for a she-cat. Call me Aunt Cicely. Cicely Taberner is my name, and Thacker's is my home, and heaven's my destination." She gave me a rollicking laugh and went back to her bread-making. "Now make thyself useful," she continued, "and ye mun feel at home." "I do, Aunt Cicely," I murmured breathlessly. "Go and pile wood in the bread oven, for the loaves will soon be raised, and it's not near hot enough." She pointed with a stout forefinger to the heap of brushwood in the corner, and I went across the flagged floor, treading softly on the rushes, through which I could see the yellow-bordered stones. I pushed the green wood in the deep oven, which went into the wall at the side of the fire, on the left of the open fireplace. Above my head, slung across hooks in the wall, were longbows and spiked halberds, long shaft with hatched heads. But the blades were rusty, and the wooden handles dark with age and wood smoke. Next to them was my aunt's warming pan, which she used for airing my bed. To take the chill off, mind you, for you'll be nesh, my dear, coming from London. It was polished like a mirror, and one of the girls stood before its reflecting surface and tidied her cap. I stared, fascinating, wondering at its strange companions which might have used in ancient war. "You've maybe never seen a longbow afore," said Aunt Cicely, as she caught my curious glance. "They don't have 'em in Chelsea, but here we keep to the old ways, and these were used in long-ago battles by our family. We've got many an aged thing kept from days long past, and if they could speak they'd have perilous tales to tell. The warming pan is new, and as good as a mirror for the wenches to set their caps straight." She stooped over the trough and pommeled the dough into a great creamy brown bolster, not white like the dough I had seen before. Then she lifted the whole trough down to the floor and set it by the fire for the bread to rise. The young boy moved aside from his place on the hearth. His eyes were fixed upon me. Never for a moment did he look away, so that I felt as if a savage beast were watching my movements, ready to spring. The custard was poured out into a shallow dish, and the girl stirred it with slow, even motion, murmuring a rhyme to keep the eggs from curdling. The second maid gathered up the broken shells and put them in a tub and crushed them into fragments. "Them's ready for wash and dye, Penelope," smiled Dame Cicely. "We uses up all our eggshells for whitening Mistress Babington's linen, but get ye gone and gather some herbs for the possets." "Where from?" I asked faintly, and my voice sounded husky and dim. "Where from, Aunt Cicely?" "Harkee now, where from? And where should they be from? Herbs for beer in the fields and hedgerows, but for possets you mun go to the herb garden beyond the yew hedge. Pick fennel for the fish, and rue and borage for Mistress Folger himself, and a pinch of lemon balm for young Mistress Babington, who likes it spread on her pillows. Get a plenty of comfrey and strewing herbs, and some bay for the venison stewing in the pot over the fire. Here, Tabitha will go with you and help. She'll like to get a breath of fresh air and a peep at Tom Snowball, who's trimming the hedges this morning." Tabitha blushed and drew a ready curl from under the edge of her cap. I liked Tabitha's cheerful face. Her arms were as brown as nuts, her skin freckled where the sleeves were rolled back, and her face was good-natured, although she seemed quick-tempered. She lifted a lidded basket from the wall and took my hands in hers, and then we ran out of the white porch into the sunshine. Hens clucked and pecked in the sweepings from the stables, and cocks strolled lazily across the yard. Scents of sweetbriar came from the little hedge by the door, and the spaces of the stones of the path were filled with yellow musk. I looked up at the house, to seek for my room and others which I had forgotten. The house was larger. Another wing was there. There were many windows with small leaded panes and squares and hexagons, and tiny casements through which I got a glimpse of striped woolen curtains and brightly woven stuffs. Some of the farm buildings had gone or were part of the house, but the church was the same. Then I noticed that the shields around the tower were clean and fresh, with the carvings distinct. A mason was chiseling one of the shields, and Tabitha stopped and looked up at him. "Thou wilt have to be speedy," she cried, pitching her voice high. "Thou wilt have to hurry with thy carving, Mr. Stone. Young Master Anthony's coming home, and he'll expect to see it finished." Master Stone shouted something which made Tabitha blush. "Impudent hound!" she exclaimed. Then she pointed out the new emblazon on which the mason was working. "A.B. and M.D. That's for Anthony Babington and Mary Draycott. Her arms are put alongside his, as the custom is." We passed the oak-studded door of the church and the yew trees in the churchyard, and took a path skirting a lawn smooth as green silk with a cedar tree in the center. On the border grew an oak tree which I recognized as the giant tree under which I had rested with Uncle Barnabas. The forking boughs and the horizontal branch were the same, but the girth of the tree was smaller. Uncle Barnabas! The memory shot through me, and I struggled as in a dream. Where was he? Then he faded from my mind as Tabitha's warm fingers drew me on. Our path was separated from the green by a yew hedge with a peacock and ball trimly cut. Through a wicket I saw a lady pacing under the cedar, reading a letter. A couple of hounds lay with their noses between their paws, half asleep, and a small spaniel danced around her flowing skirts. I stopped to stare at the lady in her fine dress sprinkled with little embroidered flowers on the kirtle and stiff white ruff upstanding round her neck. Then I whistled softly to the dogs. "Good boy, here," I called, and the lady lifted her head and stared at me in amazement, just as if I had no business to be there. "Hush, wench!" cried Tabitha. "Have you no sense? You mustn't call when Mistress Babington is here. Where are your manners? Haven't you been taught none in Chelsea? And no whistling. Don't you know the adage? A whistling woman and a crowing hen deserves to have their heads cut off." Tabitha reproved me with angry voice. The dogs came bounding across the lawn, but when they came near me they gave little whimpers of fear and retreated with their tails between their legs. I cared nothing for Tabitha and held out my hand, trying to coax them, but they ran back to the lady, growling and trembling. "Tabitha," she commanded in a clear young voice, proud and haughty. "Tabitha, bring that boy to me, and don't talk of heads being cut off. There are too many heads lost in these days to joke about it." "She's no boy, mistress. She's Penelope, niece to Dame Cicely, come from Chelsea to help her aunt. She's dressed up in some clothes from the play-acting chest, or from that press where the poor folks' weeds are kept for Mistress Foljambe's charities, madam." "Come here, girl," said Mistress Babington, and I opened the gate and went close to her. I looked up into her pale face, at her deep blue eyes in which there was unhappiness, and the crimson bow of lips unsmiling and stern. Her hair was brown, with little curls on her forehead, half hidden under a white-winged cap of a delicate lace standing stiffly out like petals of a rose. "You are the girl who looked into my chamber. I remember you," said she slowly, staring at me as if puzzled. "Curtsy to Mistress Babington," whispered Tabitha fiercely, and I obeyed. "What is your name?" said Mistress Babington. "If it please you, my lady, it's Penelope Taberner, from Chelsea, London," answered Tabitha, speaking for me eagerly. I opened my mouth to interrupt, but Tabitha went on in her cheerful way, as if wishful to change the lady's thoughts from London. "We're going to gather herbs for your possets, madam, and for Mistress Foljambe, and that's why we came this road." "Away with you then, Penelope, and see you obey your aunt, for she is the mainstay of this house of ours, and if you grow up like her, it will be well. But don't go hunting in the play-acting chest, nor must you ape the men and whistle." She gave a sad little smile, which made me like her. She flicked her long white fingers to dismiss me and turned away. All the time we had talked, the dogs were whimpering, but when I went through the narrow wicket in the yew hedge, they returned and played round the lady's violet silk dress. She sat under the cedar tree looking after me, and I glanced over my shoulder and saw the sunlight fall through the flat boughs and fleck her dress and cap with bands of brightness. "Who is that lady?" I asked Tabitha, as we hurried along the unevenly paved path. "Who is she, and why did I have to curtsy?" "She's Mistress Babington, Master Anthony's young wife, and is his mistress here. Leastways, she's mistress part of the time, but when Mistress Foljambe, Master Anthony's mother, comes from Derby, then we have two to obey. But they got on well together, and we love 'em both. You curtsy because it is the custom. Don't you curtsy to your betters in London, or are you freer and your manners there? What ails you? You'd best have a cupful of rue tonight to clear your wits." She spoke severely, but in a minute her face brightened as she looked through the bushes. "Let us run down this alley where no one can see us. There's the herb garden at the end. You pick the herbs and I'll go about my own affairs. I must have speech with Tom Snowball, the gardener." So I gathered the pungent grey-green herbs which grew on many small bushes in the Thacker's herb patch where I had been before, and I sniffed the strong, clean smells which were those which permeated the Thacker's kitchen, where bunches hung from the beams and walls. As I filled my large basket with the sprays and leaves, I looked round at the flowers in surprise. For although my Aunt Tissie's garden had many a bloom, as I knew very well, for I went there every day for a posy, this garden was more carefully tended, and lay in straight lines and squares like a patterned quilt. There were the same small daffodils, which my aunt called daffodildillies, growing in masses by the walls, and white violets and snowdrifts filling the crannies of the path. Gillivers, striped and yellow, sprung from the mossy walls where a cat crouched, eyeing me balefully. The beds were bordered with little low hedges of box, smooth as green walls, cut into trim shapes like the hedge. There were bushes of lad's love, which sent out their rich fragrance, and lanes of lavender, and clumps of spraying rosemary, which many a rose tree growing alongside, already in full leaf. I wandered about on the narrow paths which led me in a maze in and out and round about a dozen flower beds which would soon be ablaze, each one bounded by the box hedge. Pale lilies of the valley and blood-red primulas were out with bees hovering round them from the straw skeps perched on stone stools farther up the garden. Tall orange lilies, bronze-budded, stood like soldiers guarding them, and overhead darted the blue swallows. I went back to the herb patch and filled the basket. Over it I slipped the brown lid and clasped it with a wooden pin which dangled from it. I gazed up at the blue sky and the rounded hills and woods. Then I heard laughter, and away down the alley among the lilies I saw Tabitha and a young man. He wore leather leggings and rough, heavy shoes clogged with soil and a short leather coat on his back. His eyes were bright as an ox, and his cheeks ruddy as a ripe wood nut. His head was black and tousled, for he had taken off his round leather hat and stood with hair on end. He put his arm round Tabitha and kissed her with loud smacking kisses which she seemed to enjoy. Then he saw me peeping over the hedge. "Ah, the little spying wench from London! I'll bust thee too if thou tell'st on me," he cried, laughing, and Tabitha sprang from his arms and came back very red in the face. "Penelope, not a word to your aunt," she warned me. She took the basket, and together we returned along the garden path toward Thacker's. When we reached the wicket, I saw 4 ladies sitting under the cedar tree sewing and talking with their heads nodding together. "Master Anthony's 2 sisters and his mother staying with us. Since his marriage they spend their time between Thacker's and the big house at Derby, but they all love this place best." I wanted to stop, but Tabitha forbade me. "It is not for us to speak before we're spoken to. Keep to your own side of the hedge," said she. "I've seen them before, playing a game in a room," I explained, and I peered over my shoulder at their quilted skirts and their proud young faces, and the sad eyes of the older lady. "Maybe. They've their own parlour upstairs, but you've no business spying. You munna enter except to wait on them," said Tabitha severely. We went past the open door of the church, and from within came the faint sounds of music, very sweet and gay, and a boy's voice sang a carol. "Master Francis, plain as lute," said Tabitha, grown cheerful again, and we looked through the doorway. I saw the boy who had leaned from the window, but now his face was grave. He was gazing up at the beams of the church, unconscious of my peeping eyes, singing in his clear, fresh voice, plucking the lute carelessly, and the music was cold as the voice of a stone angel in the choir. Softly, without disturbing him, we went back to the kitchen. I unlidded my basket and scattered the herbs on the table. Then I sat down to watch Tabitha empty a creel of fresh speckled trout and start to clean them. Aunt Cicely took boiling water and made a posset of some of the herbs she chose from my collection. "You've brought some wrong ones, as I didn't ask for," she said, turning over the green and yellow sprigs. "Why did you get basil and hyssop? Surely you know the names of all herbs. Your mother should have taught you. Even in Chelsea they grow in the fields, don't they? Or don't you go herb gathering?" "No, Aunt Cicely." I shook my head. All this time the humpbacked boy sat by the hearth, turning the spit with the brown, crackling fowls trussed upon it, and his strange green eyes were fixed upon me. I tried to talk to him, but I couldn't understand the grunts he made. "He's dumb, poor worm," said Aunt Cicely with a hearty laugh, as if she thought it very amusing. "No need doctor he. He's as the good God made him. He was found by Master Anthony, deserted by gypsy vagabonds, and he brought him here near dying. Master Anthony's priest baptized him Jude, for he was found on St. Jude's Day." The boy looked at her as she talked, and then pointed at me and made queer noises. I went up to him and took his hand in mine, for I was sorry for him with his ragged leather clothes and hands scarred and blistered and scratched. A quiver went through him at my touch, and he shivered and gave a horrid cry. Then he bolted like a startled rabbit through the open door. Tabitha left her fish to catch him, for the spit had to be turned. "What ails the lad? What did you two affright him, Penelope?" asked my aunt. I only touched his hand," I faltered. "He's timid as a hare. Sometimes I think he's got extra senses by our Lord to make up for those others he's lost. He knows things we don't know. He feels through his fingers what we can't understand with our ears and tongues and minds. He warns of storms brewing, and bad luck, and even death. Last night he came in with a little elder pipe, made by one of the stable boys, maybe, but he played queer music like fairies might make, or even like Robin Goodfellow himself plays in the dairy, although the poor fish he couldn't hear a note, or so we think." She pointed to the little elder pipe, which lay on the hearth, and I knew I had seen one like it somewhere. I couldn't remember where, for the memory was like a faded dream, and it slipped away at once. Tabitha came back with the boy, and he sat down by the hearth with quick glances of fear mingled with pleasure. He picked up the pipe, and then looked searchingly at me, and between our eyes a flash of knowledge swept. Once he rose and came across to the oaken stool where I sat watching Aunt Cicely and Tabitha, and he touched my dress and shoes and smelled my hair, but he would not lay a finger on my outstretched hands. Then he turned back again, and kept his eyes on my movements as if I were a strange animal he did not know. I was too much interested in all I saw to trouble about him. Our old dresser filled one side of the room, but instead of the china jugs and best dinner service, there was ranged a variety of pewter plates and dishes, drinking horns and flagons, bowls of wood and earthenware. On a shelf by the fireplace were brass and pewter pans, a great fish kettle, and some iron skillets with little legs upon which they stood on the hearth. Wooden candlesticks were fixed to the wall, and one of the maids drew out scraps of tallow and put in fresh candles from the bundles hanging by their wicks. A pot of musk glowed golden on the deep window-sill over the broad stone sink where I washed myself, and the scent filled the air. In the little window which looked on the church was an hourglass with the sand slowly trickling through, and Aunt Cicely glanced at it now and then as she went to the oven and looked at the flat loaves baking there. She put her hand in a canister and brought out some strong peppermints, which she gave to me, and I sucked them as I watched the slippery speckled trout on their bed of grass. "Where have they come from?" I asked. "From the River Durand. Master Francis catched them, ready for his brother, Master Anthony. He's a papist, and this is a fast day for him. We're expecting him home from London, thank God." The River Durand. That was what Uncle Barnabas called the little river by whose side we drove, but others called it the Derwent. So Uncle Barnabas was right, as he always was. Yes, I knew where the trout had been caught, and my thoughts flashed down to the lovely winding river with its fringe of alders and willows, to the black stones over which it rushed, and the water hens and kingfishers which haunted its tossing, singing waters. "Master Anthony's the old faith?" questioned Tabitha. "Don't he go to the chapel here?" "Sometimes, for appearance's sake, but a priest comes here with him and says mass in his private room and teaches Master Francis Greek and Latin. We all know Master Anthony is a Catholic, but it doesn't do to talk about such things these days, with the persecutions of the Catholics and hatred of the priests. We have mass in the chapel sometimes, and why not when it is his own chapel and the family an old Papist family? There are spies about, but not here. Thacker's is such a lonely place. Nobody would ever come here. If they did, they would see nothing, because there is nothing to see. We are God-fearing family, Mistress Foljam and young Mistress Babington, and Master Francis, and all who live here. And we go to chapel on Sunday and listen to Parson's long sermon and honour the Queen and keep her laws." Thacker's, I said to myself. Thacker's. And I tried to remember more. Aunt Cicely was on in her comfortable slow voice and the warm burr which took all alarm from my heart, so that I leaned forward to hear. "Master Anthony will have fine tales to tell of the Queen's Court. He's been there on and off for 3 years, since he was 18, although he went to London first to study law at the Inns of Court, like all proper young gentlemen." Aunt Cicely's hands fashioned the round flat cake, spiced and honeyed as she talked. She pricked them in a device of leaves and put candied fruit on the top. "He saw the Queen in her gilded barge on the Thames, and he's been at Greenwich Palace and mixed with the greatest in the land. That's Master Anthony. He's very clever, writing his poems and reading his Latin and Greek books. He'd be welcome at court where there are many witty gallants," added Aunt Cicely, proud in the exploits of her beloved nursling. "Why did he study law?" asked Tabitha, and she skewered the trout on long wires and tossed the guts to the cat and kittlings. "All landowners must have a knowledge of law," explained Aunt Cicely patiently. "And his stepfather, Master Foljam, also the Earl of Shrewsbury, as gardener, arranged for him to prepare for the duties which would fall to him when he came of age. He is a handsome gentleman with a fine figure, and in London he met others who were at the Queen's court, but he was a courtier at another court before that of Queen Elizabeth, and there he learned to make pretty speeches, proper for a queen's ears." "Another court?" Tabitha was surprised, and I listened amazed. "He learned the ways of a queen and the manners of courts from a more beautiful queen than Queen Bess. With his gracious manners and wit and comely looks, he was welcomed at Greenwich, but I doubt whether he pleased Queen Elizabeth, for he didn't flatter her like others who flit round her throne. She's a glorious, masterful woman, and everyone must admire her for the peace and prosperity she brought to England, but Master Anthony's heart is elsewhere." "He has his young wife waiting here," Dame Cicely interrupted Tabitha, eager for romance. She paused in her chopping of fennel and looked towards the window as if she sought her lover. "Surely he doesn't love another besides Mistress Babington?" "He was married before he was 18, said Dame Cicely, "and he loves his wife in a right and proper way, but his heart is given to one above all others. There are different kinds of love, Tabitha, and you know only one. There's love for your sweetheart and wife, which is different from mother love for your childer, and there's love for your country, which makes you go fight the French and Spaniards, and there's love for God, which is the best of all, but there's another love, born of beauty and sorrow. Master Anthony loves the greatest and unhappiest lady in the land, the Queen's cousin." Dame Cicely had dropped her voice, and she looked round cautiously as she spoke. The other maids were in the far corner of the room, busy with clanking pails and brooms, singing and teasing as they swished the stone passages, splashing water on one another, stepping through the pools and the flagstones in their high iron-heeled pattens. "Mary Queen of Scotland," she whispered, "the Queen's cousin and heir to the throne." Tabitha started and dropped the speckled trout she was holding, so that it slithered to the floor and was pounced on and carried away by a great cat. Away ran the sly creature, and the maids ran after with their brooms, shouting, "Oi, Tibby!" "The captive queen!" cried Tabitha in surprise. "Hush!" warned Dame Cicely, nodding and glancing around to see if anyone had heard. "She's got beauty and wit and a tongue of silver and eyes that kindle a fire in all men's hearts," she continued warmly. "She has no age, they say. She is lovely and fresh as the dewy morning. Young Anthony was page to the Earl of Shrewsbury when he was not but 14, and he lived at Sheffield Castle, where the Queen was imprisoned. His father died when he was only 10, and his mother was filled with pride when he was appointed there. Master Foljambe, his stepfather, had a hand in it, and was mighty pleased, for he was fond of his stepchildren. There, at the castle, Anthony worked at Latin and Greek and French with his tutor, and there he learned to sing many a song and turn rhymes deftly and make up sweet airs for the lute. There, too, his young heart was caught by the loveliness of the poor prisoned queen, lack a day. "She must be a real beauty," Tabitha agreed. "I've heard my father talk about her, for he saw her walking in the gardens at Hardwicke Hall when he was working before he fell sick. He said that Bess of Hardwicke didn't like Mary Stuart and called her cruel names. Scarlet Woman and whore." Aunt Cicely frowned. "Yes, everyone knows the Countess is jealous of the Scottish Queen, of her charm and her lively ways and witty talk. Those who go to Sheffield Castle go to buy and sell, to show their wares to the Queen's servants and ladies, for there's a fine lot of them, nearly 400 serving people. They say that the talk of her in the kitchen and servants' quarters is that her skin is as white as milk, her lips red as the rowan berry, her veins blue as the sky, and the blood of her body flushes her creamy skin like the wild roses in the lane yonder. Her voice is low and full of tremors, stirring to young hearts. That's what they say, those who have heard her speak, although it is hard to get near her, she is guarded so closely. She is kind and loving to those who serve her, not like Queen Elizabeth, who is hard. But Mary Stuart never forgets a wrong." "Then she'll have a lot to remember," said Tabitha. "Aye, she was born for delight, but she had little enow these last many years, pindling in captivity. Master Anthony once told me she would play with her pages and make a pretence of a banquet when they sat out in the gardens, with wee silver cups of wine and dishes of tiny cakes and sweetmeats, and they would eat and drink, forgetful she was a queen. She would laugh merrily, and one would sing a ballad, and she clapped her white hands and rewarded him with a box of comfits or a toy. There she romped with her little dogs, or fed her birds from her own lips. Then she would remember and sit for hours unspeaking, with her eyes staring far away and her mouth working bitterly with her unhappy thoughts." "That's like Mistress Babington," said Tabitha. "Sometimes she plays with the dog Bell, and sometimes she sits all forlorn and tears fall on her hands." "How long has the Queen been imprisoned at Sheffield?" asked Tabitha. Dame Cicely counted on her fingers. 10, 12, yes, 12 years come Michaelmas. I know, because it was a wild, windy autumn, and one of the great walnut trees was blown down. We thought it was a sign of something, and the next thing we heard was that the Queen of Scotland was coming. Master Anthony's father went to see her travel the road with her suite, crowds of horsemen and soldiers. We thought it wouldn't be long before she was moved to London to be with the Queen in her palace, perhaps, but it seems she'll stay there till she dies." "And now Master Anthony's coming home," cried Tabitha excitedly. "Yes, and quite time too, for he ought to look after the lands his father left him. Lee and Codnor and Winksworth, with farms and woods and lead mines and quarries, and all the people waiting to welcome him back. Thacker's is his home, not London." "Thacker's is my home, not London," I echoed. Then I remembered something, and I looked at the weapons above the fire. "Aunt Cicely," I cried, springing to my feet and clutching her woolen sleeve, "where is Uncle Barnabas?" "Uncle Barnabas? My brother Barnabas?" she asked, astonished. "What's the wench talking about? Your Uncle Barnabas was killed in the wars in the Netherlands. There's his dinted helmet, brought back by Abel Fletcher. 'Twas his little wench Penelope you favour so much." "Killed! Uncle Barnabas!" I burst into tears. Tabitha put her arm round me to comfort me, and Aunt Cicely came round and kissed my wet cheeks. "There, don't take on, my dear," said she. "He's in paradise along with Sir Thomas More and all of 'em." But from outside there came a great clatter and noise. Shouts rang through the air. Men came into the kitchen, buttoning their leather jerkins, fastening the buckles unloosened while they worked. They drew on their long boots, and their wooden heels clanked on the stones, and their spurs brought sparks. They smelled rankly of stable and byre, as they pushed and jostled and talked loudly to Aunt Cicely. "They're coming! They've been sighted from the top of the Staff. Will Stoker was minding the swine in the woods of Cliff Rocks, and he saw the cavalcade riding in the south. They'll be here in an hour, and we're going to Ford to meet them, for the river's high and they'll want help. Young Master Anthony's coming home for good." Horses were saddled, and men rode down the lanes, past the brook to the hills, whose rounded shapes I already knew by heart. and they went with a pennon waving in the air with the arms of Master Anthony upon it. Tom Snowball ran to the church with Abel Fletcher and rang the bells in a joyful tumult of music. Young Mistress Babington came out of the house wearing her green riding habit, and the white horse was brought round for her. Tabitha and I watched her ride away with the boy Francis to meet her husband. A flag was hoisted on the tower, and Aunt Cicely and the maids hurried to prepare. I went to the porch to see the flag flutter on high, to watch the rooks fly cawing from it in affright, and the pigeons wheel as the ringing bells tossed in the high tower. As I gazed up in the blue, limpid air, the flags faded away into a white cloud. The bells were the sheep bells in the pasture. Across the fields I could see a chestnut pony with a boy astride. I looked back to the kitchen where Aunt Cicely and Tabitha were lifting the iron pot from the fire. But even as I looked, they became dim as wood smoke. I met the eyes of the boy Jude, who was staring at me as if he saw a ghost. I waved, but he shrank back, covering his face with his hands in terror. Then I ran out of doors, across the grass plat where white cloths were bleaching, to the gate. "It's your turn, Penelope. Didn't you go upstairs? I suppose you hadn't time to change. You were in such a hurry to get back." "Hurry to get back," I echoed, softly. I had been away for hours. Days, it seemed. But the fingers of the grandfather clock had not moved while I was away. Like a dream which abolishes time and space, which can travel through years in a flash and to the ends of the world in a twinkling, I went into another century, and lived there, and returned before the pendulum of the grandfather clock had wagged once behind the bull's-eye glass. I had experienced the delights and anxieties of another age, moving quietly in that life, walking in the garden, talking and loitering, and returning in the blink of an eyelid. It was neither dream nor sleep, this journey I had taken, but a voyage backward through the ether. Perhaps I had died in that atom of time, and my ghost had fled down the years, recognized only by Jude, and then returned in a heartbeat. I looked down at my hands, from which a sweet and disturbing scent came. It was musk from the garden path of another age. I stood motionless, waiting for something to happen. Ian rode up on the pony, Betty, and I mounted. I took the reins without speaking, and I galloped up the fields, my head in a whirl, my heart pounding as I breathed the icy coldness of the air. I pulled up at the top of the hill and stared about through the gaps in the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of a company of horsemen riding on a distant slope. I listened for the sound of the horn which the fair-haired boy Francis had wound as he cantered away, for the echo was still in my ears. I looked up at the sky, at the floating clouds and the wind-swept, tossing trees which moaned under a rising wind. The fivefold hills were lavender, indigo, violet in the soft light, one behind another, concealing the small villages in their shadowed troughs. Life went on unseen in those misty shallows, and another life moved in the folded layers of time. I turned the pony round and came slowly back to the farm, trying to puzzle it out. There before me was the church, with its broken shields in the tower, and the latest one, which the unseen mason was shaping, was already weathered and worn. Hens clucked around the doorway, as they had always done, and a cock crowed with shrilly challenge. In the yard cattle were lowing, and the sheep with their tinkling bells came down the pasture with the dogs. I was living in the past and present together at Thacker's, the home of my ancestors. I saw the web and woof of time threaded in a pattern, and I moved through the woven stuff with the silent footfall of a ghost. Slowly I rode across the yard to the stable door, and Ian met me angrily. "You've ridden too fast," he cried. "You galloped her up the hill, and then you let her stay still, all sweating. She's all of a lather. Penelope, you don't deserve to share a pony." He rubbed the darkly streaked sides, and I bit my lip, already forgetting. I didn't know what possessed me, except that I wanted to see someone before he disappeared, to catch a glimpse of a pageant of blue and silver somewhere in the distant woods, to hear the sound of a horn. "Don't scold her," said Uncle Barnabas, and I clung to his warm, work-hardened fingers. He was there, touching me, and I had had a bad dream about him. He would never die as long as Thacker's existed. "She's my brown lass, and she's done naught amiss," said Uncle Barnabas valiantly. He gave a hearty laugh as we went into the farm kitchen, and I started, for it was the deep laughter of Dame Cicely. There was the fire, burning unchanged, but the great cauldron of venison was replaced by a copper kettle which sang a quiet song. In front of the blaze, instead of the spit turned by a swarthy, green-eyed boy, was a Dutch oven with a bird grilling in it for dinner. Instead of the long, shafted weapons, the pikes and halberds, were my uncle's guns, polished and cleaned, ready for use. There on the left was a cupboard where the bread oven had been, and I opened the door and looked inside. It was filled with flat irons and crimping irons of many sizes and weights. Penelope, you mustn't open Aunt Tissie's cupboards like that, cried Alison. But Aunt Tissie turned from the fire, her old face crimson with heat, the little white tucker in her dress all creased and crumpled. That was the bread oven once, Penelope, in old days. Even in my grandfather's time we made our bread in it, but now we cook in the ordinary oven. Times have changed, but they say bread is never as sweet now as it was when they baked it by charcoal. She took some herbs from the table and dropped them in a brass pan on the fire. Then she called us to the table. Dinner's ready, my dears. Blow the whistle for Jess. He's right with the sheep. I hope you've got good appetites with your riding, for I've got something very nice, and you'll never guess what it is. Fresh trout from the Darrand. A gentleman staying at Bramble Hall caught them this morning, and their servant lad brought some down for me, seeing as I have visitors from London who don't get trout every day of the week, I'm sure.